Hello and welcome. I'm Dr. David Litwa, and I'm here with a very, very, very special guest, a colleague, a friend who's written an absolutely brilliant book, a study which will be shaping the field of Johannine studies for hopefully several generations. Hugo Mendez, who is associate professor in religious studies at the UNC Chapel Hill. And so he works very closely with Bart and, in fact, has co-written, I believe, the latest edition of Bart's very famous textbook on the New Testament. And yeah, so Hugo is got his PhD from University of Georgia, correct? And yeah, very warm welcome, Hugo.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, David. This is such a pleasure.
Excellent. And this is going to be basically a series of questions about Hugo's book, which is forthcoming when?
So I think the online version is May. It's already available for pre-order, but the print copies I think come out in July.
Okay, and so what's the official title, just so everyone knows it?
Yeah, so the book is The Gospel of John: A New History with Oxford University Press, and it's one of two books that I'm putting out in roughly the next year on the Johannine literature. This is the one that's dedicated to the gospel, and it's reception.
Excellent, excellent. And I know you've been working on this for years. Hugo has many, many articles as well, I think, on this roughly in the same basic area. But this is really going to be like the Titanic study, the real punch, I think. And hopefully we can, after this study, just stop talking about the Zebedean authorship, John, son of Zebedee, as author of this text. But lest I get ahead of myself, I want to first ask Hugo about how you got into, well, A, religious studies more broadly, because that's not inevitable, and then B, into specifically this Johannine pocket of scholarship, which you've been doing really interesting work.
Yeah, thank you. And I've often said, found the unguarded back door into the field of religious studies and New Testament studies. So I did a PhD in the University of Georgia in linguistics. I had done a master's degree in religious studies also at Georgia, and I had come into contact with a professor who, drew me into linguistics, and it was, really interesting, really exciting, really challenging. But on the day of my doctoral dissertation defense, my doctoral advisor asked the question at the end of successfully passing my dissertation. He asked me, "You don't really like linguistics, do you?" In one of the most kind of sincere, sweet moments. And he was right. In some ways, I realized that I had done this entire degree in linguistics, and my dissertation actually touched on the Gospels. He was the sort of advisor who gave me my dissertation topic. It's a kind of an older model. But yeah, it was something where I was working in the Gospel literature, and it occurred to me just how limiting linguistics was as a rubric. There were questions I wanted to ask about the Gospels that had nothing to do necessarily with how they were translated or what their comparative syntax looked like in different Indo-European languages. I think I was really interested in authorship and date and theology, intervention, all of the kind of different interpretive issues in the text. And so I did a postdoc at Yale for 2 years. I moved into a postdoc at UNC Chapel Hill, and I was hired onto the tenure track at UNC. And that's been about a decade now. I'm an associate professor, and really, really grateful to be here, in this very interdisciplinary setting, asking lots of rich questions and being a part of the kind of community that you're part of, right? You're central to also. In terms of Johannine studies, that was a bit different. I knew I liked Gospels. I had done a course in the Gospel of John at some point in the University of Georgia as part of my, flirtation with religious studies in different ways. I remember that I had read J. Lewis Martin's History and Theology of the Fourth Gospel, which is a classic book, 1968, that is often viewed as the kind of first great articulation of the Johannine community hypothesis as it would crystallize, through the late 20th century, second half of the 20th century. And so, in different ways, I think that Martin's book was just so fascinating. The image of the community was so fascinating. And I was really drawn to different interpretive issues in John. I was really drawn to this entire image of an ancient Johannine community and what I could learn about them. What's really funny is I didn't get into Johannine studies imagining that I would end up writing an article called "Did the Johannine Community Exist?" With The answer, no. So for me, there's been kind of an arc and journey even through this field, but I think that's part of what makes it all rewarding.
And there's a lot of people trying to hold on to the community idea. This is something that Robin Faith Walsh has kind of published about in a much more general sense, but you've kind of zeroed down on the Johannine literature, and I think made a really excellent case. Um,
Yeah, I mean, I'll say just briefly, if you think about where Robin's work is, where Stanley Stauer's critiques of the Johannine community hypothesis are, or even some of the other critiques you've seen out there, right? Richard Borkham and the Gospel for All Christians kind of camp. These critiques have been very good at dismantling communities in other corners of gospel studies, specifically for the synoptics. The Johannine literature, the Johannine community has always been more resilient, more resistant to these kind of trends. And in part because I think there are really special issues unique to this literature. For one, the existence of the Johannine epistles and their relationship with the gospel. So yeah, it's kind of, sort of in the vein of existing critiques, but I'm trying to crack a different kind of nut, which has been tough and fun and hard. Yeah.
yeah. No, excellent. So we've gotten into a major thesis that we're not dealing with the Johannine community. We're dealing with an author, but we're dealing with an author who is, in a sense, hiding or concealing his or possibly her true identity. And that's something that's not exactly pseudepigraphy because they're not saying that they are someone else. You use the term, I believe it's what do you use? False authorship.
Yeah.
Because you don't like forgery either, which is interesting, given the currents there at UNC. But how did you come down on false? Is it false authorship?
Yeah, so I do disguised authorship or false authorship. I like disguised authorship best, but it's hard to kind of put that together in a nice little sentence. Like I like falsely authored text. Disguised text isn't as clean. Yeah, so I did, I kind of mentioned this at the beginning of my book, that pseudepigraphy is a term that we use, obviously, for the practice of an author disguising their identity in a book, co-opting the name and or persona of a different author. The challenge with pseudepigraphy as a term that I saw is that pseudepigraphy historically actually encompasses two very different practices. One of them is what I'm calling disguised or false authorship. Again, an author claiming to be someone they're not, or implying such. But it has also historically been used for texts that were misattributed. That was another way in which a text could be falsely titled. And so I saw pseudepigraphy as too ambiguous a term to use for the Johannine texts, which frankly have been subjected to both practices. I think they are, the Gospel of John and the epistles of John that will follow it, texts that were written in a mode of disguised authorship. But they're also texts that have been in later, years, decades, centuries, misattributed to John, the son of Zebedee. And so pseudepigraphy wasn't as narrow and tight enough for me to really speak with some specificity about this. I am perfectly comfortable with the language of forgery for John, 1 John, 2 John, and 3 John. And this is, of course, my colleague Bart Ehrman at UNC Chapel Hill wrote a well-known book in 2012, Forgery and Counterforgery. He wrote a trade book version, also Forged, and he has definitely been one of the people who has argued strongly that forgery is the better term to use. I like the term generally, not least because I think it's one that people in different adjacent fields can recognize. I think this is a literary practice that we should draw comparisons between examples in different centuries. I think that modern practices, early modern practices, medieval practices of forgery are in many ways continuous with what we're seeing in antiquity in what I call false authorship. But I did find that when I have used that term forgery in print, it has turned out to be very explosive and lightning roddy, and because some people read negative connotations in the word forgery or have their own working definitions of forgery that tend to try to narrow out certain data. So I throw in the book the fact that I think forgery is a label that can work for this literature, that it arguably applies here. But I've remained more comfortable with something neutral sounding, partly because I'm always this scholar who sort of recognizes, as strongly as I believe in an opinion, this is a field where you're actually supposed to persuade people, right? There is a persuasive exercise here, and I've wanted to kind of find terminology that potentially could be more persuasive.
Okay. Yeah, no, that's good. I think that's a really good explanation. So early church tradition wants or eventually centers on John, son of Zebedee, for this character that you and I both think is created, the beloved disciple character. And that's an interesting development. It's not actually crystal clear in the text itself, which is interesting, and I causes me to wonder if the author wanted to gain what is later called apostolic authority. Why do you think he didn't make this identification between the beloved disciple and the son of Zebedee, John, son of Zebedee, more clear? Is this question even the right question?
Yeah, I mean, if that's the particular apostle he might have had in mind, even if he had a particular apostle in mind. It seems clear to me reading the Gospel of John that the author expects you to probably identify the disciple whom Jesus loved as one of the 12. I think this reflects how the author tends to use the word disciple. I think it's the way that he's constructed the last speech of Jesus to his disciples, the farewell discourse, chapters 13 to 17, in which he's in the private company of those who have been with him from the beginning, whom he has chosen, which are, terms that he uses for the 12 elsewhere in the book, that I have chosen you. So I think he imagines that it's one of the 12. I've never been entirely convinced that the author had John, the son of Zebedee, necessarily in mind. I think that the author liked on some level a sort of strategic ambiguity here. He wants someone who is in Jesus's inner circle. In fact, he constructs someone who could not be more in that circle, right, than the disciple whom Jesus loved, reclining on the breast of Jesus. But I think that I think this is my basic kind of working notion of this, and you've written about this subject too, is that when you make a specific claim, it potentially opens up some level of falsifiability. And the author, for whatever reason, decided to keep the identity ambiguous enough and worked with something where it's neither necessarily confirmable or falsifiable. It sits there in part to, I think, help readers defer an immediate judgment of how they feel about this authorial claim. The enigma, the mystery exists. I was at Yale, of course, for a couple years, and Harry Attridge, one of the really most prominent Johannine scholars of our generation, or our time right now, has also commented on this. He has a particular article in which he describes the search for the beloved disciple as a restless quest, and he suggests that the anonymity of this figure and the ambiguity of this figure could also be a literary device that's meant to draw readers in, really generate interest, intrigue in who this figure might be, and that there are actually, sort of literary goals that you accomplish in keeping readers glued to the text, reading, rereading it, trying to crack this riddle. I'm very open to that sort of idea too, that there's some literary purpose in ambiguity that could speak to an author trying to create readerly interest.
Mm. And also readerly identification.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, right, that's the other one, right? That if you have a disciple whom Jesus loved, who is an idealized character in the book, then he is definitely someone who potentially models true discipleship, who potentially readers can identify with, enter the story with. You see those kind of moves in literary criticism of John, if that's what you're speaking to. Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah. So on the issue of provenance, so and this is, a question only I think I could ask, because I've been very interested in Alexandria as a site in the early second century for the development of early Christian theology. And there's been actually some linguistic arguments for John being in Alexandria. I think the use of a word. Um, but when I read John, and I think your discussion really brought this out, there are just certain themes there that do remind me of early Alexandrian theology, things like the deification of the believer, and you have a beautiful chapter, showing how that works exactly. The idea that the flesh profits nothing, the idea of realized salvation, the idea of knowledge being important for salvation, use of the logos doctrine. anti-Judaism. I mean, we know early Alexandria um, has some very, very, very difficult issues going on there with the Jewish people. And what I'm calling deferred demiurgy, which is related to the Logos doctrine, which is the idea that God doesn't create the world directly. He uses a mediator figure, which is the Logos, to accomplish that, and that seems to come through very clearly in the prologue. And if I had to make a guess, which would be a guess, I would say that the least we could say is that this author, I know you put the text around 100, but I think even if you have that date, I think you could still say that there's a kind of intellectual home for this sort of theology. And
Yeah.
even if you don't want to pinpoint on a map where the figure is, and that's perfectly fine, what would you say to Alexandrian or influence from Alexandrian thought? Obviously, you talk a bit about Philo and etc., but is there any way you would go deeper?
Yeah, no, I'm very sympathetic to the idea that the gospel might be Alexandrian. This is one of those places where, so in our field at present, if you were to line up most scholars and ask them where was John written, many of them are going to say Asia Minor. They're going to, talk about something like Ephesus. They're going to do that on the basis of second century and onward church tradition that claims that the Gospel of John was written in Ephesus. And you think especially of Irenaeus here. What's always struck me about that particular claim is that Irenaeus also tells you that the author of the Gospel of John is the author of Revelation, a text that, by the way, of course, centers Ephesus. The very first message to the church is to the Church of Ephesus. It's definitely looking at other churches that are localized in Western Asia Minor. And so, it strikes me that there's really something problematic about this tradition from the very beginning, that it is paired with, for one thing, another tradition, the common authorship of John and Revelation, that is in itself disconfirmable and disconfirmed by modern scholarship. And more so that the relationship between John and Revelation would also explain potentially why Irenaeus thinks that John must hail from this part of the world. So, I mean, I think I can start by saying I don't think it's Ephesus. Alexandria works for all the reasons you're talking about, right? It's the right kind of intellectual matrix. Again, you mentioned that in the book I argue, and I'm not the only one who makes this argument, that there's, I think, Philonic influence in John, or something perhaps genetically related to Philo. That's actually the safer kind of idea. But something that we can put on the same sort of map of Hellenistic Jewish thought, especially as we would associate with Alexandria. And then, yeah, all of these kinds of Christian themes that we tend to find well represented in Alexandrian thinkers. And here again, you have been, I think, the foremost scholar right now and really kind of fleshing out Alexandria for us and the intellectual climb of it. In the book, I stopped short of trying to assign the gospel a particular provenance, and partly because I recognize that ideas can travel, right? And texts can travel, and we see this all the time. And so something that might fit very nicely in Alexandria could still theoretically be at some geographical remove. And yet I really like it. I really do like it. Yeah. I think the other factor we have to weigh in, though, with provenance of the gospel is the fact that this author does seem to know the topography of Jerusalem, does seem to have a stronger kind of anchor in what feels like a knowledge of Palestine. I note in the book that could reflect experience in the Levant in some way, whether it's, somewhere along in Palestine, Syria. Potentially, this is an author who has connections who might be located closer to Jerusalem or something like that, or works in the region. But I stopped short of that because I think it's still very possible that the author could have also gained some of this knowledge, potentially from people who had experience in the region, from maps, from other sorts of sources that don't survive for us today. I think it's really hard to pin this down. So all of the sympathy in the world towards the idea that it could be Alexandria, I just stopped a little short and got a little trigger shy on that.
Right. Well, yeah, duly so. Yeah. So Alexandria it's not just a place, it's also a kind of mental space for some. Clement of Alexandria obviously spends time in Alexandria, but he is not from Alexandria. And so there's some things about his theology that seem Alexandrian, but he's constantly disagreeing with, other theologians from Alexandria, mostly those who get to be called Gnostic. And yeah, so I admit that's a kind of a tricky one, and you need to preserve caution. That's okay. So you've got false authorship, and you've got someone who is extremely creative and has thought of a way to conceal or hide the identity. And yet, at the same time, as part of that creativity, to bring out what seems to be formerly unknown knowledge about Jesus, maybe even, we might not go this far, but secret knowledge, or at least unrevealed knowledge about Jesus. And it's effective and persuasive, and people don't seem to have a lot of resistance to John. We hear a little bit of resistance by a guy named Gaius in the late second century in Rome. But apart from him, there's really an amazing, sort of by 150, I would say, pretty much everyone is using John. And so I guess the question here is for me, and this is a loaded question, of course, but if we can imagine or reimagine John as a sort of apocryphal gospel, it's the apocryphal gospel that had the most success, as it were. But is it also a Gnostic gospel? Would you say that the knowledge, in the broad sense, that the knowledge revealed in this gospel is coded such that it's formally secret and then coming out as a kind of new revelation, based, of course, on a new story of how this particular apostle had special access to Jesus, which is such a common trope that we find in other so-called Gnostic gospels. Anyway, I just wondered if you had thoughts on this.
Yeah. Obviously the term Gnostic gospel has been thoroughly problematized, complicated in our field, and as the term Gnosticism has, and where we draw the line. One of the issues we have, of course, is that some of the features that we might think of or associate with Gnosticism, for instance, knowledge, even knowledge that borders on esoteric knowledge or is esoteric, those are features that we can find supposedly what we might construct as non-Gnostic writers indulging in, right? Clement has a notion of, knowledge and true gnosis and things like that. So, that's one challenge that we face. Scholars have problematized the fact that, when we use the word Gnostic, we're probably just reinscribing an old Orthodox heretical divide. And then, of course, the word Gnostic, I think it's, Williams, right? That says it says too much and says too little, right? These texts that we have under the canopy of Gnostic gospels are so intellectually diverse, and they're moving in such different ways sometimes that it feels hard to put them exactly in one rubric. With all of those kinds of caveats aside, there is something, of course, that tends to work about that term for many of these texts that we think of as Gnostic gospels, and that notion, that centrality of knowledge, the idea of secret knowledge, the idea that Jesus had secret teachings or teachings that he confided in a select few of his disciples, or whether it's the Gospel of Mary and Mary Magdalene, the Gospel of Thomas, and apparently the record that Thomas has at the very least and has constructed for us. That's something where those motifs fly. One of the major moves that I make in my book is to argue that the Gospel of John is, I think, much more similar to the Gospel of Thomas and the Gospel of Mary in its basic pretense than we might otherwise think. This is a text with an author that presents himself, I think, fundamentally as the disciple whom Jesus loved, or at least centers the disciple of Jesus loved as a source or witness for this text. And this author, this disciple, is understood and constructed to be someone who had a kind of special access to Jesus. He's someone who not only that, but has a real true spiritual insights that the Spirit gives him. He has the ability to recollect teachings of Jesus that have been forgotten. Jesus in the farewell discourse tells the group of the disciples with him, including the disciple whom Jesus loved, that there are things he's telling them in this particular discourse that they will forget. but that the Spirit will bring all things into their remembrance. And so it's doing things that map on very nicely to much of what we're finding in some of these Gnostic Gospels. So I like the label. It's not quite how we tend to use the label, especially if we're, just essentially using Gnostic to mean heretical. Although I think that in some ways, John is participating in, again, the same sort of literary authenticating strategies as the Gnostic Gospels. And to be very clear, I think that the Gospel of John has very interesting resonances with some of these Gnostic Gospels. I think notions of spiritual resurrection, notions of deification, different things that I think show that the Gospel of John may not be in the same intellectual world potentially as the Gospel of Thomas, clearly, but I think that it's along that path. I think it's an interesting other sort of data point in this kind of spectrum of Christian thought that's closer to the Gospel of Thomas than I think it is to some of the texts that we find in the New Testament that aren't making those sorts of moves. So John may be the first apocryphal gospel in the words of Moody Smith, but I'll also buy that it's the first pre or proto or something Gnostic gospel at the very least. We know that more than one group we loosely call Gnostic really loved this gospel.
Right, which brings me to the Secret Book of John, or sometimes called Apocryphon of John. So I think this is probably, in the form that we have it, is early 3rd century. But at any rate, it uses the character of John, son of Zebedee, which adds something to the profile, maybe something based on the Acts of John. But the idea that, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but the idea that John as a character, as he's developed at this time, he doesn't, immediately after the resurrection, he still doesn't have quite the knowledge that he should have. And so he's still worshiping at the temple. And there's a point where he turns aside from the temple and then has this grand revelation of Jesus. And then essentially the entire book of the Secret Book of John is this record of the revelation in which John is speaking now in the first person and is able to ask Jesus a bunch of questions.
Yeah.
And so we can see that, it's clear that whoever's writing this book is building on the foundation already laid in the Gospel of John. But I wanted to pick your mind about this idea. I don't know if it's unique to me, but it seems like in the narrative world of what's going on, the author of the Secret Book of John is creating what we might call a prequel to the Gospel of John. And is in the Gospel of John, and again, feel free to disagree, the beloved disciple is very, very intimate with Jesus, but it's never said that he gets a revelation, and certainly nothing as long and drawn out as what we find in the Secret Book of John. And one of the things that the Secret Book of John points out is that, John's complaint at the beginning was that, you spoke about the hidden unknown realm above, but you didn't really tell us anything about it. And so after John gets this long revelation, then at that point, he has become truly the beloved disciple with special knowledge, which would then equip him to write the life of Jesus in a way that is higher or more sublime, let's say, than the other 3 gospel writers, because he has this as the foundation, the new revelation. So it's no surprise that he would be able to speak better about the symbolic meaning of Jesus's acts, because he really actually does have higher understanding. It's like he has transcendent intellect. Anyway, I've just wondered your thoughts.
Yeah. You should publish that. You really should. No, I think it's really interesting to think about. Obviously the Apocryphon of John, Secret Book of John, in the idea of John receiving a revelation of Jesus, and scholars sometimes see that as a possible evocation of what we've already seen in Revelation by the 2nd century, end of the 1st century, depending on when you date that text. So there is this tradition of John getting heavenly insight that it seems like the Secret Book is building on. But the Secret Book of John definitely has a Gospel of John knowledge and base far more robustly, at the very least in its framing, right? And certainly in the kinds of questions that John in that original inner dialogue he's having right before Jesus appears to him. Definitely these are questions that are shaped by the Gospel of John, by the sorts of things Jesus has said in different discourses in the Gospel of John that now Jesus descends from heaven to answer for John. In that respect, yeah, I think that's a great idea. The idea that what we're looking at in the secret book of John is potentially one author or a set of hands that have gone ahead and really thought about how did this recollection process happen for John? How did this spiritual insight mature? And I think that works. I think the one place where I might perhaps finesse that is to note, though, that even in the gospel, right, the beloved disciple has supernatural insight of sort. He has certainly idealized contours, and he has a capacity to seemingly perceive things those around him can't, right? So he'll go to the tomb with Peter and looking at the state of affairs in the tomb, seeing what's rolled up and folded up where, he's able to believe where Peter's not. So, there is already this sense that he's the right fertile ground for this. I don't think this is in any way, a contradiction to what you're saying. I think it's actually just the extra little base to this, right? He's already someone who, before he understands, has that kind of faith. But, as you get in John chapter 20, right, the disciple believes, but he doesn't yet understand. The text is saying very clearly. And so, yeah, you have to imagine events by which the author understands finally what's going on. And I think something like that could be what the secret book of John is playing with. I think that's great.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. Yeah, so it's the point where faith becomes knowledge. So the secret book of John tells the story of where John's faith becomes knowledge, or where it becomes understanding. Yeah, I guess that's a better way to put it. Yeah. I have some questions that we can run through quickly, and you don't have to. I mean, I said to Hugo that you don't need to over speculate if you don't have an answer to these, or because these would be very unique to me. But one of the things that you do in the book is that you make the case that John knows Luke, and so you've got gospel dependence, and so you draw the arrow in one direction. And so my question to you is, though, couldn't we make that more of like a cyclic arrow, like the arrow from John to Luke? Actually, it's like a mutual influence, like a feedback loop. If we imagine these texts not as boom, written in their final forms, the first time they hit paper, but as texts that are developing in the early second century. And the reason why I say this is, again, very unique to me, but I've become very interested in Marcion's gospel and about the theory that it is, in fact, a prior instantiation of what then was or became the Gospel of Luke. And so, although I completely agree with you that the author of John knows Luke, it's also, I think, perhaps demonstrable that the author of Luke knows John. And the example that I'm thinking of is, you mentioned the tomb of Jesus. So in Luke, or canonical Luke as we have it, you've got a scene that is not in Marcion's text, and we know that it's not because the church fathers say that it's not. But they don't have a scene in which Peter goes to the tomb to visit, right? And so that's not in Marcion's text. But in canonical Luke, you've got a scene where after the disciples disbelieve in the women, apparently just because they're women, that Jesus has been raised, then Peter goes to the tomb and he takes a look around, and then he walks away wondering. And so there's reasonable speculation anyway, and it is educated guesswork, that whoever the author of canonical Luke is may have known that scene in John where Peter and the beloved disciple go to the tomb, they have a look around, and Peter is kind of hopeless, but John, as you mentioned, has faith after seeing these events. What are your thoughts on any of this? Is any of this relevant or plausible on any sort of level, or how would you frame some of this?
Yeah, that's great. So I think first, I do believe that there is a Gospel of Luke that predates Marcion. I'll at least kind of give you that as my starting point here. But I agree with you that it may not have been of the same shape as our current text of Luke, and certainly the passages you mentioned in Luke 24 are part of the questions that the possibility of interpolations, non-interpolations, in that kind of area in that particular chapter. There's always the question about the status of Luke chapters 1 and 2. And of course, these are the things that Marcion's Evangelion seem to be picking up. I'm persuaded by those who see Marcion as something like an early text critic. I know Ian Mills just came out with a good article kind of conceptualizing Marcion as text critic in the latest Jack's Journal of Early Christian Studies. And so I think that there are different versions of Luke that are floating. I think some of them represent changes to Luke. And I, yes, would be perfectly open to the idea that John knows an earlier version of Luke that he's drawn things from, but that obviously in the evolution of the text that we will construct as Luke, when we as scholars talk about these texts. And I think things are obviously much more fluid in early centuries than something like our finished Luke and our very non-porous Luke. That I think it's clear from the examples you give in Luke 24, right, that there's definitely Johannine influence feedback back onto Luke. Yeah.
Okay. Good. Well, I know that I'm not crazy. Okay. So we've got this tradition, and this will be my last question. We've got this tradition that from Irenaeus, which is actually somewhat corrected by Eusebius. Irenaeus says that his mentor, or his wannabe mentor anyway, Polycarp, knew John in Ephesus. Yeah. And that Irenaeus seems to think that that is the Apostle John. Mm-hmm. And even Eusebius seems to think that that's wrong, that that's a figure, that there were actually two Johns, and one of them is the elder, and that's the one that probably Polycarp knew. But but still this myth that Irenaeus tells, or I shouldn't call it a myth, I should call it a story or an account. It's a tradition. I agree with you that we probably shouldn't call that memory, in the sense that if we call it memory, then we're not talking about things that are necessarily true because they're encoded with human eyes. We're dealing with something that is passed through the human brain, a story that is told that Polycarp knew the Apostle John in Ephesus. And so how do we get to that exactly? I guess I'll stop there with the first part of the question. And would there be any basis to that?
Yeah, so, certainly when Eusebius is suggesting that Irenaeus is wrong about some facts, as I recall, he's especially talking about Irenaeus's interpretations of Polycarp, Papias's exposition of the sayings of the Lord, and the fact that you have two Johns that are referenced in what Eusebius identifies for us as the introduction to the book. It's clear that Irenaeus understands references to John the Presbyter or John the Elder as references to John the son of Zebedee, it would seem. He uses John the disciple of the Lord, and I think Eusebius is right to think that Irenaeus is saying John the son of Zebedee when he says John the disciple of the Lord in all instances, and that he's conflated these two Johns. Eusebius spends his time, when commenting on that passage in Papias, trying to very clearly argue that the John, son of Zebedee, who might be the first of the two Johns mentioned, is not John the Presbyter, John the Elder, who's paired with Aristion in the second part of that. This is a really hard debate to get into. And then let alone, like you mentioned, Irenaeus then also has this idea of Polycarp and his links to John, and there's this extra stream. Part of what's really difficult is that you have two patristic writers here, both commenting on a lost text who evidently understand it very differently. A text whose, kind of few fragments are themselves ambiguous on the very questions they're debating. There's the fact that Irenaeus uses John the disciple of the Lord and never quite uses son of Zebedee right where we would need him to use it to be very clear often what he's talking about. And then for that matter, there's this entire wash and world of Irenaeus's claimed links back to apostles through other figures, which is paralleling his other and not unproblematic claims of apostolic succession for different churches that he's created in very kind of tight linear sort of trajectories where, we tend to think that the, obviously succession of the bishops in Rome, proto-Catholic bishops in Rome, is probably not as tight and clean as anything that Irenaeus is describing, to the extent that we could even suggest that it's there in this earlier period that he's describing. So this is the challenge. This is really the challenge. I think that there is every possibility that the historical John the son of Zebedee spent time in Asia Minor. I don't know that. My reason for suspecting that that's very plausible is that the book of Revelation places John, who I think is meant to be understood as John the son of Zebedee. But here again, we enter into the ambiguity. But I think the book of Revelation assumes that the figure was active in Asia Minor. I can't tell you for sure if that's the historical case, but I can tell you that definitely it's a possibility if you're looking at a text like Revelation. I can tell you that Irenaeus is very invested in trying to build links back to the apostles for himself and other bishops in his theological orbit and world. And so he is especially interested in the kinds of claims and connections he's making for Polycarp, for himself, for, obviously where he wants to put Papias into this picture. That's as far as I could say. I think that the hard part that we face as historians of early Christianity is that there are really so many more questions than answers, especially from that late first, early second century period. I think this is, for all of the texts that we do have from this period, from all of the kinds of traditions that we inherit, it's really a kind of a strangely dark period, right? And I say that in part because, when Irenaeus gives us information about this period, for instance, authorship of the Gospels, there's so often things that are disconfirmable. When Papias, the traditions he relates that are, quoted in fragments by other writers, supposedly open up this world, the things that we can actually verify, the things we can confirm or disconfirm, are disconfirmed. I'm not sure that late second century Christians I really had a firm grasp of what was happening at that time. And it may seem odd. It may seem really odd to people that a writer writing around the year 180 or so just doesn't have crystal clean access back 80 years. And some people might expect, there must have been really strong, firm lines of oral tradition. But, I kind of remind people. So I'm not sure that the average American Catholic parishioner could tell you about the members of their parish 80 years ago. I can't tell you that they would know the members of their parish 30, 40 years ago outside of a certain age. I can't tell you that they would know the priest of that parish. I can't tell you that they would know the struggles or challenges of that parish unless they were written down, unless they were very carefully preserved by a church historian working at the parish, a church secretary or something like that. I think that oral tradition, oral memory isn't a lot of what we think it is, which is this, really very concrete, very stable thing that gets preserved very carefully year to year, decade to decade. I think there was every possibility that Christians are, by the late second century, not having a firm grasp of Christianity a century earlier, except from the little snippets and things that they're sort of getting, which, again, don't always seem as reliable as we'd like them to be. And I say that as someone who mourns that reality. My purpose here, like I always tell my students, as a historian, I'm not invested in having more skepticism about this. I would love it if we could actually have all of this data, all of this tradition, all these traditions available to us in a way that we could trust. Unfortunately, I think there are reasons why my trust wears thin when I read some of these things.
Right. Yeah. Well said. Well said. So we didn't get to talk about the letters, but I wondered if I could just, for the sake of clarity for the audience, just ask, is John the Elder then a non-historical person? Is he then just a character from 1 John or 1 John?
Or perhaps better 2nd and 3rd John, which actually use for presbyter. Yeah, I don't entirely know. First of all, what's going on in that passage of Papias? I even looked at it yesterday separately. Papias mentions 2 Johns. He mentions or uses the name John twice in what remains of the fragments of his exposition of the sayings of the Lord. He mentions a John, and he mentions a John the presbyter or John the elder. Part of what makes this ambiguous is he's also called that 1 John an elder presbyter right before. Are these the same person? There are people that have argued that. Are they two separate people? There are people who argue that. There are so many questions about the identity of those, of just John the Elder and his relationship to John the son of Zebedee in that fragment, that I'm confused. And I don't think we have the data to settle that definitively. If we assume that this is a separate figure from John the son of Zebedee, there are still even more questions that I would ask. I suggest in the book, tucked away, that I think John the Elder may be an invented character, an invented eyewitness. I think Aristian may be an invented eyewitness. At the very least, I don't think anyone has the evidence to definitively rule that out. We know that ancient authors, you brought this out in your own work, as part of authenticating strategies, can create invented eyewitness lines and traditions for what they claim. In the case of Papias, we know that Eusebius says he cites John the Elder, John the Presbyter, and Aristian frequently by name in his works, using them as the foundation for the traditions he relates. The traditions we have from Papias, certainly the ones we can confirm or weigh in on, are ones that are rather, I think, straightforward to disconfirm. The one tradition that he assigns directly to the presbyter, whom we assume is John the Presbyter, that Eusebius quotes for us, is the tradition about Mark's authorship and connection to Peter. It would also seem that perhaps this figure has also given us the tradition about Matthew's authorship, although that's not entirely clear or explicit. But these are traditions that are not the ones that we have the highest confidence in as scholars right now. So, if you're pairing two figures we haven't heard about, assuming John the Elder is not John the son of Zebedee, so John the Elder and Aristian, and if you're coupling them with traditions that are dubious or open to question, and in a period of time where people are known to invent eyewitness lines, I'm skeptical a little bit about the historical existence of John the Elder. Now, what strikes me about the epistles, obviously 2nd and 3rd John, use the words, apply the phrase the elder, or the title the elder, to the authors of these texts. And I have argued in my work, and I'll make the case even more robustly in my next book coming out later this year, The Epistles of John, Origins, Authorship, Purpose, with Cambridge University Press, although I also argued in this Gospel of John book. I think 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John have the same basic authorial claim as the Gospel. I think they want you to believe that they are written by the same person who penned the Gospel of John. In that case, it is really interesting to me that 2nd and 3rd John use this term, the elder, for this figure. The question then is, when do these texts date? And I think it's entirely possible, and I argue in my next book, that these texts could date to the mid to late 2nd century. In the case of 3rd John, theoretically, it could be a 3rd century text. There's no reason why we can't date these texts later. And if that's the case, then I can't rule out the possibility that it's actually Papias's looser way of using elder and presbyter, sometimes applying it to the disciples of Jesus, clearly, that couldn't potentially be framing 2nd and 3rd John's application of the title, the elder, to a figure that by the mid 2nd century is widely being understood as John the son of Zebedee by Christians of multiple persuasions. We're seeing this in Valentinian texts. We're seeing this in Proto-Catholic texts. I think it's all over.
Mm. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I think that's a wonderful place to finish. And so I guess I can't regret too much that we didn't get to talk too much about the epistles, because we'll have to have you back when your epistles book comes out. But I just, first of all, I just want to thank you so very much for your time. And I want to plug this book because, folks, Hugo was very kind enough to send me this just at the proof stage. And this is a wonderfully written book. It is crystal clear English, and I'm not sure what Oxford University Press is charging, but this is accessible to, I would say, anyone who has any real desire and interest to read it, and that's a lot for an academic book. This is a very well-written text, so take advantage of that. Go get this book. I think this is going to be a game changer because it definitively collects all the arguments and makes the case for a new history, which is also very, very careful and well documented. So thank you, Hugo, for writing this book. And besides your next book on the epistles, is there anything else you want to plug to this audience or mention at all?
Oh no, well, I just wanted to say, actually, the editors at Oxford were really wonderful. They have priced it affordably. So this is you can get it under $40, I think. I think right now the pre-order is at $35. So this is going to be a book that stays, my understanding is no higher than about the $40 price point, assuming all global supply chains stay intact. But yeah, it's very much was written as something of a crossover book. I wrote the book really wanting my partner, who is not at all in the field of New Testament. I wanted her to be able to read this book, and so yeah, it's great in that respect. I'm really grateful to them and grateful to you for having me.
Excellent. Well, be well and prosper, and hopefully we will see you again very soon. Thank you again.
Thank you so much.